All right, up next is inductive arguments. So just as a reminder, last video we talked deductive arguments. A deductive argument is an argument where when the premises are true, the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. Inductive arguments are not trying to do that. Inductive arguments are trying to establish the probability of their conclusion, right? So an inductive argument is an argument where if its premises are true, it could still be the case that the conclusion is false. So there's a sense in which, strictly speaking, an inductive argument might be considered invalid, right? Like if they were trying to be proofs, they would be invalid. But that's not what they're trying to do, right? An inductive argument is an argument where, given these premises, this conclusion is probably true, right? And that's what they're trying to establish. These are much more common, especially in like the sciences, right? These I think are much more common in real life. We use these kind of arguments all the time, right? We're not usually trying to, strictly speaking, prove something. We're trying to say, hey, look, given the data that's available to me, given the evidence I have, this is what I think is the case. This is probably what the world's like, right? Most of what we see, I think, in moral philosophy, most of what we see in general is inductive. We do this all the time. Here's an example, right? You come home to your house, there's, and you see the following, right? You see a dog, you see a pile of garbage in the hallway. What would you conclude? You'd probably conclude that your dog got into the garbage, right? And that would be reasonable to conclude given the evidence available to you, right? But it's not guaranteed to be the case, right? It could be the case that your dog's innocent, right? Maybe the neighbor's evil cat broke in, framed the poor dog, and then snuck back to their house, right? That is entirely possible given the evidence. And inductive arguments are always like this, right? So when we're talking about inductive arguments, we don't talk about soundness, right? We're talking about cogency, right? So our reasoning is cogent when we have an inductive argument where our premises are true and it's likely to be the case that our conclusion follows from those premises as well. Given, of course, that it's always possible with an inductive argument that our premises could be true and our conclusion might be false. Another example, Brenda smokes 2 packs of cigarettes a day for 40 years. She visits her doctor, tests positive on a test for lung cancer that's 99.8% accurate. Highly likely that she's got lung cancer. Again, not proven. It's possible that, she behaved this way, tested positive, and still doesn't have lung cancer. But you would be reasonable to conclude that given this evidence, she does have lung cancer, right? So induction is not an attempt at proving anything. You're rather making a claim about what's reasonable to infer from a given set of evidence. You've got a theory. You're trying to say this theory is best supported by the available data. That's what we support. A lot of people think that this is what science does, and certainly science relies quite heavily on induction, right? If we want to make any claims about the future, if we want to make any claims about an incomplete set of information, we have to use induction, right? We can't use proofs. Deduction, if all the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. Those kind of arguments only can tell us what we already know, right? Like when you've got a deductive argument, your conclusion is simply restating, in some sense, what is already the case given your premises, right? So you're not learning anything new about the world other than sort of like a different description of what you already had available to you when you use deduction. What inductive arguments are doing is quite different, right? Inductive arguments are saying, given the data that's available to us, it's probably the case that things are a little different, right? So if we want to make claims about the future, if we want to make claims that go beyond a set of evidence that we have available to us, we have to use inductive arguments. They're incredibly powerful. Probably the default method of much of the sciences. One really important kind of inductive argument is what we call induction. These are arguments where we're inferring to the best explanation of some event, right, or some phenomenon. So an inductive argument is an argument that looks like the following. You've got some data available to you or some event that's happened. There's something you want to account for or explain. And then you've got a bunch of theories, right, that could explain that data. What you're doing with an inductive argument is you're looking at those theories and you're saying, hey, this particular theory that I've got is the best explanation for the data that's available to us. And therefore, we're going to conclude, given the available evidence, this theory is probably true. Tentatively, we are going to embrace this theory. Why? Because it's the one that best accounts for the data that's available to us. It does better than any competing theory. A lot of people think that's really what's going on in the sciences.